So, back in the autumn of 1962, India didn't just lose a war. It was so much more than that. The country lost its entire self-image. You see, the conflict with China wasn't just some military defeat. It was a deep national shock, the complete collapse of a worldview that had been built on idealism. And this is the story of that collapse. And that question, it really gets to the very heart of what happened in '62. Because this war wasn't truly lost on the icy slopes of the Himalayas. No, the battles fought there were just the final brutal outcome of a disaster that had been building for years, in faulty maps, in closed-off mines, and in some really critical political miscalculations.
So, to really get a grip on this defeat, you gotta peel back the layers. We're gonna look at 3 catastrophic failures. First, a failure of the mind, then a failure of the system, and finally, the inevitable failure on the battlefield itself.
Okay, so it all starts here, with the foundational errors. Long before a single soldier was in danger, the biggest mistakes were being made in the realm of ideas, beliefs, and, crucially, intelligence assessments.
This quote, right here, it just hits the nail on the head. It wasn't a failure of information. It wasn't that India didn't know China was active on the border. It was a fundamental failure of interpretation. They had the facts, but they drew all the wrong conclusions about what China was actually planning to do.
And this slide, well, it lays out that disconnect perfectly. The intelligence was there. It was clear. China was building a road in Aksai Chin. They were building up troops. But India's leadership was looking at all these signals through a lens of wishful thinking. They absolutely convinced themselves that China would just posture and protest, but never, ever escalate to a full-on war. That single, flawed assumption, well, that was the linchpin for the whole disaster.
Yeah, so that goodwill, it didn't last long. The 1954 Panchsheel Agreement was supposed to be about peaceful coexistence, but really, it just papered over some deep cracks. The real turning point was 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled to India after the Tibetan uprising. Beijing saw it as a huge strategic threat, and soon after, you had bloody clashes at places like Longzhou and Kankala. By the time talks failed completely in 1960, the relationship was psychologically broken. There was no going back. All right, let's dig into that next layer, because this is where we see how a bad idea becomes a catastrophic policy. A wrong assumption is one thing, but when that assumption gets baked into national policy, it creates a system that's just primed for collapse.
And this is what that led to, the infamous Ford policy. The idea was to push these small, really just symbolic military posts into disputed territory, to show the flag, to stop Chinese encroachment. But it was a political move, a bet that just being there could deter a powerful adversary. It turned out to be the immediate trigger for the war.
What you're looking at here is a classic, textbook strategic blunder, a total mismatch between goals and capabilities. The goal was huge, asserting sovereignty against a major power. But the means were dangerously low, these tiny isolated outposts with basically no real way to fight back or get resupplied. It was a policy born from the political pressure to be seen doing something. But the entire strategy was a massive gamble, staked on that same flawed assumption that China wouldn't dare escalate.
And you know what? The very system that was supposed to support this gamble was already broken from the inside. The relationship between the civilian leadership, especially Defense Minister Krishna Menon, and the military was incredibly strained. Infrastructure was almost non-existent. Troops were poorly equipped for the mountains. And maybe most importantly, there was just no way for anyone to challenge flawed orders coming from the top. The errors just kept piling up, one on top of the other.
So, that brings us to the final brutal layer, the battlefield itself. On October 20th, 1962, all those bad assumptions, all those systemic flaws, they finally crashed into the cold, hard reality of a prepared and determined enemy. To really grasp the tragedy of 1962, you just have to look at these two battles. At Namkachu, that Ford policy led to an entire brigade being put in a hopelessly exposed position. The result was predictable, a swift and total collapse. But then you have Rezang La. Here, a single company of soldiers, totally isolated, facing impossible odds, fought almost to the last man. Their unbelievable bravery couldn't change the outcome of the war, but it absolutely preserved the honor of the soldier, even as the state's strategy completely failed them.
So why was China's attack so devastatingly effective? Well, it really boils down to 3 main reasons. First, they achieved what's called local superiority. They concentrated huge numbers of troops at the exact points where it mattered most. Second, their logistics and road networks were just vastly superior. And third, they had crystal-clear limited war aims. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. Punish India, break the forward policy, and then stop.
But all of this leads to maybe the biggest, most painful what-if of the whole war. India had a powerful advantage it chose not to use. So why on earth was its most effective weapon just left on the ground?
I mean, the paradox here is just staggering. Think about it. The Indian Air Force had a clear advantage. China's air bases in Tibet were high-altitude, primitive. Their planes were limited. Indian fighters could have caused absolute havoc on exposed Chinese supply lines. But the political leadership? They were paralyzed by the fear of escalation, specifically the fear that China would bomb Indian cities in retaliation. It was another system failure, a choice to hold back your best punch at the most critical moment.
Okay, now let's be realistic here. Offensive air power wouldn't have been a magic bullet. It wouldn't have magically won the war for India, but it absolutely could have disrupted China's momentum, slowed down their advance, and made them pay a much, much higher price. It could have changed the character of the defeat, and in war, that matters a lot.
So when the fighting finally stopped, that was really just the beginning of a brutal awakening for India. The humiliation of 1962 forced a fundamental, permanent system reset. The nation that came out of this war was fundamentally different from the one that went in.
And this transformation was just sweeping. I mean, it went deep. The age of idealism? Gone. Shattered. Replaced by hard-nosed realism and a constant awareness of threats. India kicked off a massive program of military expansion and modernization. A new defense-first mindset took hold. And critically, because of that catastrophic intelligence failure, India created a dedicated external agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, or RNAW, to make sure it was never, ever caught so unprepared again.
But let's not forget, the defeat left a real, permanent physical scar on the map. That number you see, 38,000, that's not just an abstract figure. That's the square kilometers of territory in Aksai Chin that China held onto. This secured a vital road link for them. And this isn't just history. It is the core territorial reality of the dispute to this very day.
And that's really the key takeaway here. 1962 isn't just some historical event you read about in a book. It is the baseline for the entire modern India-China relationship. Every single border standoff, every diplomatic negotiation, every military deployment today is haunted by the ghost of that conflict.
So what's the deeper lesson in all of this? It's that war is never just about tanks and soldiers. It's about clarity. India had troops, it even had some key advantages, but it was crippled by wrong beliefs and a fear of using its own capability. In the end, China won, not just because it was stronger on the day, but because it had a clear goal, a correct reading of its opponent, and the political will to use decisive force. It's a lesson about the anatomy of defeat and victory that still echoes loud and clear today.